candle ceremony was quite beautiful, I thought. When Rita and I were emailing back and forth about this week's service, she told me about that. And it reminded me of something that happened almost 10 years ago now. Most of you know I was originally a Thai monk, and it was a short-term ordination. I basically ordained for a monastic retreat. So when the time came to return to the householder life, there's a ceremony for that. They're called disrobing. I know it's kind of an unfortunate name. There's no actual clothing leaving the body, but we change clothes after the ceremony. But anyway, during the ceremony, there's a bowl of water in front of the abbot at the Thai temple in Kissimmee. That's where I did this. And during the service, he was putting various things in this bowl of water, flower blossoms and pieces of incense and things like that. And there was also a small candle burning in front of it during the service. And so at one point near the end of the ceremony, the abbot picks up this candle and he lets a few drops of wax fall into this bowl of water. And then he just kind of turns it upside down and puts it into the water and extinguishes the candle. And at that moment, as that flame disappeared into the water, I felt an indescribable emotion, powerful surge of what I could only describe as sort of sublime sadness and joy. I would tell you what that meant, the candle dipping into the water and my emotional reaction to it, but I don't know. I started to talk to the abbot about it after the ceremony. I wanted to know what the candle extinguishing meant so I could put some meaning behind my emotional response. But I stopped myself. I decided I really wanted to just understand it without words, without explanations, without judgments and interpretations. It was profound, and that was good enough. So even now, when I remember that moment, there's always a little impulse to try to explain it. And in the context of Buddhist thought, there's several possibilities, but I try very hard not to think about them. I prefer to leave that moment unexplained, just have what it taught me directly, without trying to fit it into thoughts and words. There's a story, which is probably apocryphal, about the founding of what we now call Zen Buddhism. And this story goes, the Buddha called together his monks to give a talk, but once they were assembled, he didn't say anything. Instead, he just held up a flower. So one of the monks, Mahakassapa, saw this and smiled. And the Buddha smiled back. He knew that Mahakassapa had wordlessly received the realization of suchness. This is a big word, suchness. It's only 2 syllables, but it contains pretty much everything. You might say it's the realization that this is the way things are. It's the recognition that reality is fragile, it's ephemeral and insubstantial, so to cling to it is futile. Yet life is incredibly wonderful when you really pay attention. I wish I could communicate that idea directly, but I have a feeling if I just stood here holding a flower for 20 minutes or dunking candles into the water, it probably wouldn't make for a very interesting service. And it probably wouldn't really communicate what I have in my mind anyway. So I'm stuck with trying to use words to communicate what's in my heart. And hopefully, you'll notice a golden leaf falling from a maple tree, or you feel a slight chill on the wind, and you'll experience suchness for yourself. We all know that we experience seasonal changes. Days grow shorter, nights grow long. Year after year, lightness and darkness rise and fall like waves on the ocean. We get used to that and we accept it. We might even on some level know that we wouldn't enjoy the cooling of the fall weather as much if it weren't for the heat of the summer. We wouldn't enjoy the beauty of a sunrise over the ocean if it were not for the night from which it emerged. But when it comes to our spiritual and emotional lives, we often find it hard to accept the periods of darkness that interrupt periods of joy and contentment. But just as winter and summer are natural consequences of our planet's trip around the sun, so are joys and sorrows, and sickness and health, birth and death, natural consequences of being born human. So the key to happiness and spiritual peace is to accept and skillfully make use of the darkness that sometimes comes into our lives. And that means seeking a state of balance that we can maintain despite life's ups and downs, to recognize that there's light within the darkness. In Buddhism, we usually refer to this as equanimity. Not too long ago, my friend and colleague Greg Creech sent me a copy of a new booklet that he had just compiled. It's a collection of maxims, and he called it Tunneling for the Sunlight. I like that title because it kind of, I think, encapsulates what life is like sometimes. Digging through the darkness, trying to find the light. In his introduction, Greg says, when things are going our way, we're often lax about spiritual practice. But when we're struggling the most, we seek a way out of darkness and gloom. A spiritual practice's value will often increase when we're depressed, anxious, or struggling with how to navigate a dangerous passage on our journey. So we have within us the seed of Buddhahood. We call this Buddha nature, which is kind of an abstract idea. You could interpret Buddha nature as fundamental goodness. It's also the possibility of awakening. All people, including ourselves, possess this potential, even if it's buried under a lot of misunderstanding. So you've planted seeds in the past that ripened in a way that brought you to where you are today. You've planted seeds in the past that made it possible for you to love one another, to do good and charitable things, to enjoy life in the present moment. Some seeds won't sprout if you put them in the ground when it's warm and sunny. They need a period of darkness and coldness, so they'll know when it's time to come out into the light. And I think the seed of Buddha nature needs that period of darkness. I doubt that very many people start a path of spiritual practice until they realize that things have gotten dark, and then see that there's a light available, maybe reflected in the light of hope or the light of goodwill. The Buddha himself began his spiritual quest because he was in pain. He had realized that his life and the lives of his loved ones were inevitably going to experience things like birth and death and suffering and illness. And so he set out to try to find a way to transcend this. And after 6 years of diligent effort, he awakened to a path of freedom. He had sat beneath a tree for 7 days and nights of constant meditation. And as the morning star arose, signaling the coming of a new day, the light of wisdom came to the darkness of human experience. He said, when this is, that is. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. When this isn't, that isn't. From the cessation of this comes the ending of that. And as this grew clear, ardent, absorbed, he stood, routing the dark troops of Mara like the sun that lights up the sky. There are a lot of instances in Buddhist literature where people emerge from great darkness and eventually realize great wisdom by recognizing the causes of suffering. That is, the when this is, that is, of human suffering. Angulimala, for instance, I've talked to you about him. He was a murdering bandit who eventually became fully enlightened and monk. There's Kisa Gautami. She's the subject of a famous story that people sometimes refer to as the parable of the mustard seed. She'd gone mad with grief over the death of her child. The Buddha helped her find her way back to sanity by showing her the universal inevitability of death. And afterwards, she became a great enlightened teacher on her own. So many of the discourses in the Buddhist canon begin with someone comes to the Buddha seeking relief for some kind of suffering. A lot of times I'll meet people who hope to reach a point where they just feel good all the time. But it always reminds me of this blues song by Albert King that I like a whole lot. Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. Life has its ups and downs, and we can't have the ups without some downs. So our spiritual practice isn't to make us feel good all the time. It's to help us be resilient so that we're prepared for the downs. So Buddhism is really a way to live authentically. If we practice sincerely, wholeheartedly, we live a deeper, fuller existence. And that doesn't mean always floating on a cloud of warm and fuzzy feelings. But it also doesn't mean going through life feeling morose all the time. When you accept unpleasantness as a natural part of life, it minimizes the grip on you when unpleasant feelings do arise. It makes it easier to find balance amid the rise and fall of circumstance. and that balance is equanimity. Equanimity doesn't mean there's no good and no bad, or no difference between things. It means that when we fall down, we can get back up. Some people came to see me recently who were very upset because a good friend had tried to commit suicide. And they were kind of hoping that I could tell them something that would help them feel better. This had just happened. And I told them, you wouldn't want to feel good about this. That wouldn't be equanimity, that would be callousness. When a friend is suffering, you want to feel touched by that in a way that probably doesn't feel very good, but it also doesn't drag you down into despair. There's nothing wrong with having emotions. In fact, it would be bad not to have emotions. So the problem is not unpleasant emotions. It's how to deal with them skillfully when they arise. So we can practice self-understanding and diligent mindfulness and come to a point where we're not overwhelmed by what happens, by nurturing those states of mind that lead to peace and letting go of the ones that lead to stress. It's not half as simple as that sounds, I'm sure. It's kind of an ongoing process. And the first step is to recognize and accept where we are. We don't have to let an emotion dictate what we do, but we make matters worse when we tell ourselves we shouldn't feel the way we do. So, equanimity comes when we understand why things rise and fall, how that comes into play. If you understand cause and effect, you can see reality as it is, and all the shoulds and shouldn'ts that disturb us begin to subside. One of my favorite poems encapsulates I think, how we should feel about the way we feel fairly well. It's by a famous Japanese poet, Issa. This dewdrop world is a dewdrop world, and yet. He wrote that right after the death of his second child. So suchness doesn't lie in an abstract understanding of impermanence like dewdrop world. Rather, it's really the heartfelt experience of the and yet. Over the course of the year, I sat with people who were dying and grieving, facing long prison sentences, facing all the forms of suffering that come with being human. And some of them have used this time to really awaken into a deeper truth for themselves. I know that life inevitably will contain sorrows and that everything changes and we control almost nothing, not even ourselves, and all conditioned existence is going to eventually be stressful. I can tell people those things and they're true and it's what the Buddha said. But a real awakening comes in the and yet, when I can share someone's suffering and we really wish together that we didn't have to experience this darkness. The true mind of infinite light needs the darkness in order to be seen. There's a Zen koan that illustrates this point fairly well. There was a scholar named Tokusan who had heard about Zen, and some of the things that he heard seemed blasphemous, or at least kind of disrespectful toward Buddhist practice. So he decided that he would travel to the part of the country where Zen was taking hold, and he would straighten everybody out. So he carried with him on his back a big pack of notes and commentaries on the Diamond Sutra, which is one of the key texts in Mahayana Buddhism. It's really deep and profound stuff. And he happened to stop at a village for refreshments. And an old woman in the tea shop started talking to him. And she said, "What's that heavy pack that you're carrying on your back?" And Tokusan said, "Oh, this is my commentary that I've made on the Diamond Sutra in years and years of work." And she said, "Oh, I've read that sutra. It says the past mind cannot be held. The present mind cannot be held. The future mind cannot be held. So you asked for tea and refreshments. Which mind is going to drink them?" Tokusan was quite flummoxed by this question, as I'm sure you are. He realized, oh, this must be a Zen Buddhist. So he asked her, "Do you know any good teachers around here?" And she referred him to a master named Rutan, whose monastery was about 5 miles away. So somewhat chastened by this encounter with the old woman, he went to see this Zen master, who very patiently answered his questions for hours and hours. They talked until late at night. And finally the teacher said, "It's getting late. Why don't you retire?" And he offered him a room at the monastery. So Tokusan bowed, and he opened the screen to go out of the meditation hall. It was very dark outside. So Rutan offered him a lighted candle to find his way. Just as Tokusan took hold of it, Rutan blew it out. At that instant, Tokusan was enlightened. The next day, he showed up in the lecture hall and walked up to the front, and standing there in front of all the assembled monks, he burned his commentaries on the Diamond Sutra to ashes. He said, however abstruse the teachings are, in comparison with enlightenment, they are like a single hair to the great sky. However profound all the knowledge of the world may be, compared to enlightenment, it is like one drop of water to the vast ocean. In his commentaries on this story, Zen Master Muon says, 100 hearings cannot surpass one seeing. So when you see the truth for yourself, you realize that your own mind is luminous. If your mind is luminous, you have no need for candles. So thank you very much.